sleeps.
Welcome, my fellow fear enthusiasts. The doctor is in, and tonight I have another terrifying tale for you. The pen was no longer a tool. It was a callus, a calcified extension of the metacarpal bone that throbbed in time with the building's low-frequency hum. My wrist, cramped and stained with an ink that smelled faintly of copper and stagnant water, trembled as I looked up from the ledger. The transition from the administrative basement to the upper wards felt like surfacing from deep water. Lungs burning, head throbbing. I walked with a gait that wasn't entirely my own, a measured rhythmic stride as if the floorboards were dictating the pace of my movement. Room 14, the woman who never sleeps. I stood before the heavy, reinforced oak door. My fingers hovered over the brass handle. Logically, I knew the patient's chart indicated severe treatment-resistant insomnia. But the clinical notes written in my own handwriting were starting to look like ciphers. Patient exhibits hypervigilance, claims shadow paralysis, notes the smell of wet earth in the ventilation shafts. I pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the sickly, jaundiced glow of the hallway's flickering, recessed lights. She was sitting upright, eyes fixed on the blank, peeling wallpaper in the far corner. Her skin was translucent, stretched thin over the sharp topography of her cheekbones. She didn't turn when I entered. She didn't blink. "Patient 402, I said. My voice sounded thin, alien, rattling in the empty chamber of my chest. "Dr. Vance, I'm here for the nightly assessment." She tilted her head, a slow, unnatural movement, like a doll being rotated by a puppeteer's strings. Her eyes, bloodshot and frantic, didn't land on me. They landed on the space just behind my left shoulder. "You're late," she whispered. Her voice was the sound of dry leaves skittering across pavement. "The second presence is already leaning in. Can't you feel the weight of it, doctor? It likes the way your coat hangs. It's measuring you for a fit." I forced a laugh, a sharp, brittle sound that died in the freezing air of the room. I checked my clipboard. Though the ink on the page seemed to writhe, the words shifting into archaic, illegible shapes. "That's a common manifestation of sleep deprivation. 402. Auditory and peripheral visual disturbances. Your brain is attempting to fill the sensory gaps caused by your lack of REM cycle." "Is that what they told you?" She finally looked at me, and I felt a cold spike of dread pierce my stomach. Her pupils were blown wide, black holes swallowing the room's light. "Do you think your brain is the one doing the thinking? The room is breathing, doctor. Look at the corners. They're closing in. They're syncing up with the rhythm of your pulse." I stepped forward, my medical training screaming for me to administer a sedative, to assert control, but the air turned foul, thick with the metallic, cloying stench of rot. It was the smell of a forgotten basement, of waterlogged wood and stagnant earth. I gagged, stumbling back. The temperature dropped so sharply that my breath bloomed in a jagged cloud before me. The walls seemed to pulse, a subtle rhythmic contraction that felt sickeningly biological. I am the doctor here," I stammered, clutching the ledger to my chest. The skin of my palm felt as though it were fusing to the leather binding. "There is no second presence. This is a high-security ward. We are alone." Are we? Are we?" She stood up, her movements fluid and predatory. She stepped toward me, her gaze fixed on the air hovering inches from my neck. "It's hungry, Elias. It doesn't want the medicine. It wants the vacancy. It wants the silence where your thoughts used to be." I retreated, my heel catching on a warped floorboard. "Stop this. This is a dissociative break. Look," she hissed, pointing toward the observation window. Against my better judgment, against the primal, screaming instinct that begged me to look away, I turned toward the glass. For a fraction of a second, the reflection didn't show me. It showed a figure standing in the doorway, hunched and eyeless, with a long, spindly arm resting gently on my shoulder. I whipped back around. There was nothing there, just the empty, decaying room. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The smell of rot grew suffocating, a heavy, wet blanket pressing against my face. I reached for my pocket, fumbling for the key. The rusted thing with the weeping eye design, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely grasp it. I felt the building groan around me, the ceiling joists shrieking like tortured metal. "You're just like the others," the woman whispered, her face inches from mine, her breath smelling of nothing at all. You think you're the one holding the pen, but you're just the ink. My head swam. I saw the hallway outside, not as a corridor, but as a digestive tract, glistening and ancient. I reached out to steady myself against the wall, but my hand sank into the plaster as if it were soft, warm meat. I screamed, a sound that felt hollow, as if it were being echoed by 1,000 voices hidden behind the wallpaper.
Elias!
The door burst open, crashing against the stops. Nurse Shaw stood there, her face a mask of iron-willed pragmatism, though her hands were shaking. She saw me clawing at the wall, my hand buried up to the wrist in the peeling damp surface, and she didn't gasp. She lunged forward, grabbing my shoulders with a grip that left bruises. "Stop it," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut through the fugue. She jerked me backward. My hand came free of the wall with a sickening squelch, leaving behind a smear of dark viscous fluid that wasn't paint. It's eerie. My skin was stained with black mold. "Eleanor." The wall, it gave way. "Don't look at it," she commanded, hauling me toward the door. "Keep your eyes on me. Only on me. The patient," she said. Before I could finish, the woman who never sleeps let out a sound. It wasn't a human scream. It was an aperture tearing open in reality. A sound of grinding stone and high-pitched metallic shrieking that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly into the marrow of my bones. It tore through the ward's industrial-grade soundproofing as if it were paper, cascading down the corridors, rattling the glass of every observation window in the wing. The floor beneath us buckled. I fell to my knees, covering my ears, but the sound was inside my skull now, a cacophony of lost voices and weeping gears. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the screaming stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was heavy, expectant, and utterly suffocating. I slumped against the hallway floor, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Nurse Shaw stood over me, her expression a mix of pity and absolute, weary terror. She looked toward the room, then back at me, her eyes hardening. "You heard it," she said, not as a question, but as a grim confirmation. "How?" I whispered, my voice cracked and raw. "That sound, it shouldn't be possible. The acoustic insulation, the structure." "Forget the physics, doctor," she cut in, her voice low, dangerous. She leaned down, grabbing my collar to pull me upright. Her touch was icy, grounding me in the reality of her grip. "You want to talk about reality? Fine. That scream wasn't an episode. It was a harvest. You're lucky it decided to stop." I looked at the ledger, still gripped in my hand. The pen still fused to my skin. I could feel the building pulsing again, a rhythmic, slow throb that matched the pounding in my own temples. The ink on the page was rearranging itself, the letters blurring into a single, jagged line. "What is this place?" I asked, though I already feared the answer. "What did I sign for?" Nurse Shaw didn't answer immediately. She glanced down the long, shadowed corridor of the quiet wing, where the darkness seemed to pool like water. "You didn't sign for a residency, Elias," she said, her voice dropping to a tremor. "You signed for a sentence. And if you want to understand why, stop looking at the patients and start looking at the paperwork." She turned and began to walk away, her footsteps echoing with a hollow, rhythmic cadence that sounded far too deliberate. I stood there trapped in the center of the hallway, feeling the ward's gaze shifting, narrowing, focusing its entire hungry consciousness on me. I needed to see the records, not the clinical summaries, not the neat typed reports I'd been filing for weeks. I needed the raw history, the intake forms, the logs of the ones who came before me. My feet moved before I gave them the command, carrying me toward the administrative office. The ledger held to my chest like a shield. The walls around me seemed to whisper, the peeling wallpaper curling like withered skin, revealing the dark, fibrous structures beneath. I wasn't just a doctor anymore. I was a witness, and the asylum was preparing to show me exactly how it kept its books. The scream did not dissipate. It clung to the air like a wet, caustic vapor, vibrating in the marrow of Elias's teeth long after the patient had collapsed into a catatonic heap. Nurse Shaw's grip on his arm was bruising, a desperate white-knuckled clamp that pulled him backward into the corridor. She didn't speak. She moved with the practiced, frantic efficiency of someone extinguishing a fire that had already claimed the structural integrity of the building. She shoved him past the threshold, slammed the heavy, reinforced door, and threw the deadbolt with a metallic thunk that sounded like a coffin lid sealing shut. Silence rushed back into the hallway, but it was a heavy, pressurized silence, the kind that follows a lightning strike. Elias staggered, his hand flying to his temple. A trickle of something warm and copper-scented ran from his left nostril. He wiped it away, his fingers coming away stained dark against the clinical white of his lab coat. He looked at the ledger in his other hand. The ink on the page, his own handwriting from moments ago, had begun to bleed. The words "patient stable," no signs of distress, stretching into jagged, illegible black veins. That wasn't hysteria, Eleanor. Elias rasped, his voice sounding thin and foreign to his own ears. That was. It wasn't a vocal cord reaction. It was frequency. It was tectonic. Shaw didn't look at him. She was leaning against the cold brick wall of the corridor, her chest heaving, her eyes darting toward the vents, then the ceiling, then the shadows pooling in the corners of the ceiling-mounted lights. You don't get to call it by scientific names anymore, Doctor. Not after that. You want to keep your pulse. You stop analyzing, and you start surviving. Surviving what? Elias stepped toward her, his intellectual arrogance finally giving way to a raw, trembling vertigo. I came here to treat cases, to document, to cure. If the asylum is housing something that can mimic human anatomy to that degree, if it is literally rewriting the auditory laws of this ward, then we have a moral obligation to report it. To the board, to the state. Shaw let out a sharp, jagged laugh that died instantly. She pushed off the wall and grabbed his lapels, pulling his face inches from hers. Her breath smelled of stale coffee and fear. The board? Elias, look at your hands. He looked down. His skin, usually pale and cleanly scrubbed, was dusted with a fine gray powder. The same silt he'd found in room 9. But it was worse than that. Beneath the surface of his skin, along the veins of his wrist, a faint rhythmic pulsing moved against the flow of his blood. A secondary, mechanical heartbeat, synchronized with the low-frequency hum he felt vibrating up through his shoes from the floorboards. I'm an employee, he whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. I have a contract. I have a life outside these gates. Do you? Shaw's voice dropped to a conspiratorial, terrifying whisper. When was the last time you saw the sun without a window pane between you? When did you last have a conversation with someone who wasn't a patient, a shadow, or a ghost in a white coat? You've been here, Elias. You've been here so long the architecture is beginning to recognize your scent. Elias tore himself away from her, stumbling backward. He felt a desperate, clawing need to ground himself in reality, to find the one place in this rotting monument to madness where things were categorized, filed, and absolute. The records, he said, his eyes wild. Intake Form 27, Thorne's files. If the asylum is an organism, as you seem to imply, it must have a nervous system, a history, a ledger of its own intake. The administrative office is on the 4th floor, Shaw said, her voice hollow. But the stairwells have been rearranged since the lunch hour. If you go alone. I'm not going back into the belly of the beast just to read your own death warrant. I have to know, Elias insisted. He turned, his boots clicking erratically on the linoleum. He felt as though the floor were tilting, a subtle incline that made his equilibrium swim. He clutched the ledger to his chest as if it were a shield, though the pages were now slick with a strange viscous ink that smelled of stagnant pond water. Elias. He stopped but didn't turn back. If you find your name, Shaw called out, her voice trembling. Don't read the date of discharge. It's never the date you want. He didn't answer. He walked. The corridor stretched before him, a familiar path that now felt like a throat, the walls pulsing with a rhythmic, bioluminescent flicker in the recessed lighting. He passed doors that hadn't been there a moment ago, doors with names scratched into the brass plates in languages he felt he should recognize but couldn't name. Scientific rationale, the bedrock of his identity, was being ground into dust by the reality of the asylum's malice. He thought of his credentials, his medical school ring, his mother's face. They were becoming like static on a radio, distant and fading, replaced by the all-encompassing urgency of the building's hunger. He reached the stairwell, but the door wasn't metal. It was heavy, dark oak, carved with patterns that looked suspiciously like human nerve clusters. He gripped the handle. The weeping eye key in his pocket grew scorching hot, a searing reminder that he had already been marked, and turned it. The office was not an office. It was a cavernous, circular room lined with filing cabinets that spiraled upward into a ceiling obscured by shadow. In the center, sitting behind a mahogany desk that looked as old as the foundations of the world, was a mountain of paper. Dr. Alistair Thorne sat there, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes reflecting the flickering, ghostly light of the room. He wasn't working, he was waiting. "Dr. Vance," Thorne said, his voice smooth, devoid of any cadence of surprise. "I was wondering when your curiosity would overcome your professional caution. It's an evolutionary trait, you know. The pursuit of knowledge is the exact bait the trap uses to close its jaws." Elias stumbled into the room, his breath coming in jagged, shallow gasps. He held up his ledger, now a sodden mass of black pulp. "I want the files. I want the truth about intake 27. I am not a patient. I am a resident psychiatrist. I have my credentials. I have my life." Thorne smiled. It was a wide, predatory expression that didn't reach his dead, fixed eyes. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a single, pristine folder. It didn't look like the other decaying records. It looked brand new, the paper sharp enough to cut skin. "Oh, Elias," Thorne whispered, sliding the folder across the desk. "You are an excellent physician. You've spent weeks treating the symptoms of this ward. It's only fair that you finally see the diagnosis." Elias approached the desk, his legs feeling heavy, as if the floor were trying to absorb his feet. He reached out with a trembling hand and opened the file. The first page wasn't a form. It was a photograph. It was a picture of him. Elias Vance, sitting in a chair, leaning over a desk, clutching a pen. It was a photograph of the very moment he had walked into the asylum. But in the background, behind the double doors of the lobby, the walls were already weeping that same dark, viscous substance he now saw on his ledger. He flipped the page. Intake form 27. Patient name, Dr. Elias Vance. Admission status, permanent. Condition, observer undergoing assimilation. Elias stared at the ink. It began to move. The letters rearranged themselves, squirming like insects under the paper, forming new words before his eyes. The ward requires a witness. The witness requires a story. The story requires a soul. He looked up, gasping, but the office was dissolving. The walls of filing cabinets were falling away into a deep, echoing abyss. The desk was shrinking, and Thorne was no longer a man. He was a pillar of shadow, an extension of the building's own dark anatomy, looming over him with a terrifying, ancient indifference. "I am not a patient," Elias whispered, though his voice sounded like it was coming from the walls themselves. "That is the first symptom of recovery," Thorne replied, his voice a chorus of 1,000 voices echoing from the drains, the vents, and the floorboards. "Acceptance is the final stage of the procedure." Elias tried to run, but his feet were locked. He looked down. His shoes were gone. His feet had merged with the polished floorboards, his skin turning to the same aged, varnished oak. He looked at his hands, and they too were fading, the fingerprints smoothing out, the skin becoming a parchment-like texture, inked with the frantic, endless scribbles of his own case notes. He felt his consciousness expanding, stretching out into the dark, cold corners of the ward. He felt the pain of the patient in room 9. He felt the terror of the 3 minutes missing. He felt the hunger of the ward itself, a vast, hollow ache that had finally, mercifully, been filled. He looked at Thorne, and for the first time, he didn't see an antagonist. He saw a mirror. Elias opened his mouth to scream, but the sound that emerged was the soft, rhythmic clicking of a pen on a ledger, the sound of a resident beginning his shift, starting the cycle all over again, forever. Your story ends here. The nightmare doesn't. If you want more terrifying tales, like, comment, and subscribe to Dr. Never Sleeps. The lights will go out, the silence will return, and when it does, listen carefully. Another story is about to begin.